served 27 years of his life in jail for conspiring to overthrow the state. Madiba served most of his term at Robben Island before being moved to Pollsmoor and then Victor Verster prison. Following his 1990 release, Mandela travelled more than 60 kilometers to the Cape Town City Hall, where he gave his first speech as a free man on the balcony there. Joining us to reflect on this day and what it means for the country is fellow ANC stalwart Maharaj. Good evening, Mac. It's such a pleasure to speak to you tonight. One of the things that President Cyril Ramaphosa said today in his tribute was that freedom did not come to South Africa as a result of goodness on the part of F.W. de Klerk, but that it was indeed a victory for the people of South Africa due to the kind of pressure that they had put on the state at the time. I wonder what you make of those reflections, because I don't think that there's ever been a time where it has been said as clearly as that.
Good evening to you, Kathy, and thank you for remembering me and giving me the opportunity to speak with your viewers. Yes, I think that statement by President Ramaphosa is a very important one, and it is important that we interrogate it and understand what goes into that statement. That moment of Madiba's walking out of prison had come about through a bitter and long struggle. A struggle in which legal opposition to the apartheid system had been illegalized. A struggle in which we had suffered setbacks, where the organization had been virtually destroyed within the country, our movements driven into exile, our peoples almost silenced. And through 30 years of bitter struggle, the struggle was pursued, people became mobilized, and we came to that moment because it is the action of the people in South Africa and of people throughout the world who stood up against their government's support for apartheid that forced the apartheid regime to consider the need to release Mandela and other political prisoners and to begin to talk about engaging in dialogue with the liberation movements.
Part of how that history has been captured is not necessarily truly reflective of this bitter struggle, as you've put it, but rather it's almost been romanticized. What do you think that is a result of?
I think, Kathy, we need to shoulder the main blame for that. Because in the wake of the transition through negotiations, we unconsciously, unthinkingly accepted the characterization as a miracle. And you know that miracles depend on something from high above and demobilize the people from being the architects of their own future. That story that was allowed to grow put into the background the suffering and the sacrifices that people in all walks of life in South Africa had to make. When the Rivonia arrest had taken place in 1963, I recall that in the underground in Johannesburg, even seasoned comrades were afraid to even let you enter their house when the security police were on your tracks. That's the degree to which repression had instilled fear. And to stand up against that fear, there was a moment where in the 70s, a person who had a mug with a picture of Mandela engraved on it was arrested and sentenced to prison just for possession of a mug with a photo of Mandela. That was the degree to which apartheid was going. We had comrades who were being killed in detention. Others were being maimed. We had comrades who were being executed. We had people in the neighboring countries, Gaborone, Harare, Maputo, Lusaka, being the victims of military raids by the South African Defence Force. We had massacres in Angola at Kasinga, where majority of women and children in the Swapo refugee camp were brutally murdered by a parachute group, parachuted by the South African Air Force. So these are part of the mix of the struggle. We had people as far as Paris assassinated by hit squads from South Africa. We had a Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, killed, we believe, by the South African apartheid army. So this story of a risen people against all adversity, all setbacks, in the face of repression, is a story that needs to be told not only because we need to be true to history, but because the whole system of apartheid and colonialism had been designed to destroy the self-esteem of all people of color, all black people, so that without our self-esteem, we would lose the capacity to stand up and fight. And today, we need to tell that story in its fullness so that we can take pride in it, we can own it, and we can use it to build our self-esteem and our capacity to build a better future.
It's interesting because some of your own reflections 30 years on include then having a full appreciation for how nuanced that moment in history 30 years ago was. I wonder what has triggered you to look at it and explore it differently to what you had previously?
Kathy, I've had the privilege for several years to be working with Comrade Paulo Jordan, trying to write the history of the ANC. It's an incomplete task. I don't know when we'll complete it, but in the process, I've had to look at our history with great depth and in an effort to find original records. Just to give you an example of how nuanced this moment was, few people recognize that in the wake of the Nkomati Accord, which South Africa had browbeaten independent Mozambique to succumb to, and which South Africa continued to violate by supporting Renamo clandestinely with arms. P.W. Botha went around Europe to 8 nations garnering support, and they all agreed to support him. But they said they are worried about Mandela. They are worried that his death in prison may trigger absolute mayhem inside South Africa. He came back and he offered in January 1985 that Mandela was his own prisoner. He had the keys to free himself. All he had to do was renounce violence. Mandela rejected that through a speech delivered by Zinzi, his daughter, at the Jabulani Stadium on the occasion of celebrating Archbishop Tutu's Nobel Laureate Prize. But in rejecting it, he didn't confine it just to the question of released prisoners. He made a very important statement. He said, only free people can negotiate. And that meant that he put the release of political prisoners and the question of negotiations firmly on the table. From that moment, few people realized that even the first person in the white community who went abroad to exile to meet the ANC, Professor Javier van der Merwe, he in his own writing admits that he was making those trips by each time reporting to the NIS officer as Mr. Van Kroonen before he left, and each time reporting to him when he came back. But in the history books, he is regarded as one of the people making an effort to make peace. In the same way, you will see that Mandela, what was happening in the shadows, was a huge effort to push the ANC into a position where it would capitulate, just as Mozambique had been forced to capitulate with the Nkomati Accord. And it took immense effort by forces of the ANC, Mandela in prison, the ANC in exile, and particularly the leadership of O.R. Tambo, to create the mechanism in that period, in the background of the risen people and the uprisings that began in Sebokeng in 1983 and spread throughout the country. Those uprisings became uncontainable to the regime's forces. Our townships were occupied by SADF troops. The police were on the rampage. It had reached a stage where our children aged 8 to 12 years, were having to fight the police and army insurrections armed with rifles, and our children were fighting back with stones. That is what we had to go through. And in the meantime, we had to maneuver, create a framework.
I wonder then, as you go through this process of reflecting on that time, and I think really shining truth on some of the aspects of how it has been captured in history, how would you want it then to be almost brought into the present? What are we supposed to do with this information? How does it affect our present and our future as a country?
The most important thing for me, Kathy, is to understand that political change happens through the action of people, through an active citizenry. Secondly, that it needs an organization which is disciplined, which has a vision to marshal the people and channel their energies towards an agreed goal. Our agreed goal was the Freedom Charter. And we need to remember this past to understand that all change comes through struggle, through unity in action. And it needs both a clear vision and a set of strategy and tactics that are designed to garner the majority of the people. We need to understand that what we won in 1994, in the form of our democracy and our constitution, has created a platform which made it possible for us to use, to attend to all the conflicts that exist of interest in our society and mediate them through that democratic process and without us having to kill each other. But to do that, we need to have a sense not just of the suffering we went through, not just of a sense of victimhood, but a sense of pride that we have the capacity to shape our destiny. Now we need to look back. When people talk about, for example, former President F.W. de Klerk, they do not take into account that his entire life was devoted to a hardline conservative supporter of apartheid and even an implementer of apartheid. The change that came about when he became president was something that was forced upon him. What is to his credit, and we need to look at history always, not from the wisdom of hindsight, but we need to look at it as it unfolded at the time and the choices that people had in the context of those times. So at that time, what was great about him was that he perceived that there was no way for apartheid to continue in its old way. And therefore, he took a step which opened the sluice gates. Mandela, throughout the years from his imprisonment, had become a symbol, through our struggle, a symbol of hope. But a hope that was imprisoned, a hope that was manacled and in handcuffs. When 1990 came about, and Mandela walked out of prison, we all felt at that moment as if he had walked out of the past into the future. We all felt that we were marching to the future together with him as our guide. Sure. It was a moment of tremendous exhilaration. And it was a moment that we celebrated, rightly so. All right. But we must remember that the task of the liberation movement and the leadership was always that when victories are scored, let the people celebrate, but you go and stand on guard to ensure that while they are celebrating, the enemy does not ambush them and inflict massacre on them. Sure. That is what we want. That in our struggle, when we tell it, you will see instances where our leadership were the first to go to prison. And like Mandela, he chose to ensure that every one of his colleagues in the Rivonia trial were first released before he was released. He didn't choose to have himself released first and then say, I will then free others. He put his freedom from prison after the freedom of his colleagues.
Sure. Maharaj, that's